and welcome to the Georgia 3R's virtual community program entitled, Does Religious Freedom Matter in 2021? African American Perspectives of Religious Freedom. My name is Trey Daniel, and I serve as the Education Manager for the Georgia Rights, Responsibility, and Respect Project. The Georgia 3Rs Project is an initiative created to help schools and communities come together across differences and engender civic participation in a diverse democracy. Led by the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum, a nonpartisan, non-sectarian organization whose mission is to foster First Amendment freedoms for all by raising awareness of First Amendment freedoms through education, advocacy, and action, and by sharing the stories of Americans who have exercised their rights to ignite change. The Georgia 3Rs Project has promoted religious literacy, religious liberty, and civil dialogue as the core competencies that guide our work. Today, we'll be talking about key issues related to religious freedom by exploring the roles of religious freedom in America from the African American experience. Today's guests will highlight key areas that shape and define religious freedom for themselves in their roles in society. So thank you for joining us virtually today. We also hope that you and your families are staying safe as we celebrate Dr. King and his legacy this weekend. To begin, I would like to introduce someone who needs no introduction, the Reverend Dr. Robert M. Franklin, who will serve as our program's keynote speaker. Reverend Dr. Franklin is a native of Chicago, where he left in order to attend Morehouse College, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree. Dr. Franklin also holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Dr. Franklin formerly served as the 10th president of Morehouse College in 2007, where he served in that capacity for 5 years. Dr. Franklin currently serves as the inaugural James T. and Berta R. Langley Chair in Moral Leadership at Candler School of Theology. Amongst that, Dr. Franklin also is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. He is an author who recently published his book entitled Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination back in April of 2020. Please help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Robert M. Franklin.
Thank you a great deal, Trey, and thank you, David, and to all the team at the Georgia 3Rs, and to our distinguished panelists today. We gather today 2 days before Dr. King's national holiday and 1 week after a brazen and unsuccessful insurrection aimed at overturning a legitimate election. We gather to celebrate one of the shining glories of America, the freedom to believe or not believe, the freedom to express belief, the freedom not to have government or any other entity impose beliefs, the freedom to choose to believe, and then to respect the choices that others have made in the private sanctuaries of their individual consciences. You almost have to step back to realize that that ensemble of nuanced rights is rare. It is noble and pure. It is liberating and inspiring, and still for us, aspirational. And so our gathering is not simply appropriate, it is compelling. Even it is life-giving and perhaps life-saving. And so our gathering is important. But what does it matter if the right to religious freedom exists, but is largely unknown or too obscure to guide good and better behavior? How can Americans know about these rights and live in accord with them unless there be exemplars and teachers providing clear guidance and living models. That is what makes the Georgia 3Rs Project so critically important for this season in history. And so I commend the board, advisors, donors, participants, and today's very distinguished panelists who are helping to illumine our rights, our responsibilities, and this collective call to respect others. Dr. King was an exemplar of thoughtful respect for religious freedom. My favorite image of him, you've probably seen it, is locked arm in arm with rabbis, imams, monks, priests, pastors, humanists, atheists, and others who are committed to the search for truth, justice, and ultimate concern. He modeled the respect and restraint and appreciation for diversity that he hoped all people would manifest. But since the beginning of this nation, there's been tension between the forces committed to respecting liberty, tolerance, and literacy, and those committed to controlling the faith and practice of others. In early America, people, especially women, who practiced lesser-known faith traditions were tortured and burned. Later, Muslims were harmed by those who did not bother to learn about their neighbors' traditions. More recent days have illustrated the violence that can flow from the heavy hand of government imposing on those who are different. And so we call for a respect that manifests itself as humility in the presence of the great and awe-inspiring mysteries that give meaning and purpose to human existence. It is fitting that we listen to perspectives today on religious freedom from African Americans who have watched American history unfold from a unique vantage point. Our mere presence was an indictment of hypocrisy and oppression of difference and plurality. Thanks to generations of interfaith and multiracial coalitions, a better way has been provided. Dr. King said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of destiny. Whatever affects one neighbor directly affects all indirectly." And King maintained that love, that powerful, positive regard for the other, was and is a common thread that could bind, not merge, bind together various traditions. The theologian and mystic Howard Thurman urged us to think twice before you move your neighbor's landmarks. But in order to respect the most precious, the most important values that guide the lives of our neighbors, we must know something of what they are. That is why it's so important to have competent teachers of religions in our schools and in the places where reason and curiosity, discovery, and even faithfulness are formed and refined daily. After a career of working with students and speaking to young people and children, I believe that children can lead us forward to a healthier, more respectful democracy. They love to discover the diversity of cultures and faith and curiosity that animate people. They love diversity and must be given the tools that broaden the capacity to live with those who move to different rhythms. And so our work, as I think about the children out there that will be impacted, our work is hopeful. It has a future. Our work is aesthetic. That is, it understands that respect for diversity is appreciation for beauty. And the beautiful always conceals as much as it reveals. Careful study of art discloses hidden beauty that we miss with the passing glance. Our work is ethical. It requires wise teachers and moral leaders. Such leaders invite us to become better versions of ourselves. Yes, it is ethical. Aristotle and Kant, Du Bois and Ella Baker would agree. Nonviolence is better than force and violence. And the well-ordered state allows space for all people to flourish, even the nonconformists. Sigmund Freud wrote that civilization began when the first angry person hurled a word instead of a rock. If civilization is to be preserved, we must encourage dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. If we are fortunate, deep empathy will emerge, and perhaps spiritual depth and moral courage. To protect the dignity of every single person, we need more peacemakers in the culture. Our work is hopeful and aesthetic. It is ethical, and finally, it is intellectual. Oliver Wendell Holmes noted that a person's mind, once stretched by some new idea, can never return to its original dimension. A big idea. We have the right to religious freedom, and we can enjoy it best when we respect the rights of others. Another big idea. Religion can, when properly practiced, can be a force, a social force for building a just society. We have seen its power to divide and to harm. Now let us unleash its power to make us civil, kind, true, and just. Let us cast more words than stones. Let us forge ahead with preparing teachers and parents, public officials and institutions to respect those first freedoms and to honor religious liberty. Finally, a Harvard literary critic, Helen Bendler, once said that the first most precious opportunity and duty of every teacher and parent is to teach your students to love what you have loved. Teach them to love what you have loved. And as we teach, let us draw inspiration and determination from Anna Julia Cooper, that 19th century African-American feminist womanist thinker who urged all of us to lift others as we climb. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franklins, for those such elegant words as we look at the example of Ella Baker, the example of Martin Luther King, and their example of pluralism, one in which we will hope to obtain in the near future. So thank you so much. Now we want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to introduce our first panelist for this afternoon. Our first panelist is no stranger to the Religious Forum Center. She is also no stranger to the Georgia 3Rs Project, and that is no other than Mandisa Thomas. Mandisa Thomas is the founder and president of the Black Non-Believers Incorporated, which is a nonprofit secular fellowship eliminating stigma, increasing visibility, and providing support and networking opportunities around non-belief in African American community. In 2018, the Unitarian Universalist Humanists Association named Ms. Thomas its Person of the Year. Mandisa Thomas, thank you for being our panelist.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to say a few words, especially on this very important day. I am actually going to say a word that within the Black community is still seen as being very taboo and even may be offensive to some. I am an atheist, which means that I do not believe in any God, spirits, or supernatural beings, and that my worldview is based on evidence and education. And as was mentioned, the work with my organization does provide community and advocacy and education on our perspective, and also our perspectives on what we bring to the table for our communities, and the importance of the discussion about religion in our communities, even though the conversations may be contentious at times. I am currently here in New Orleans, Louisiana, celebrating my organization's 10th anniversary in existence. Now, I know for some of you, this may be the first time you have ever heard of us, or even heard of me, or even seen me. And that's okay, because again, we are still battling a very huge stigma within our community as it pertains to those who leave religion for various reasons, and also our open advocacy and our outreach. And it is only fitting that, and I appreciate Reverend Dr. Franklin for mentioning Dr. King, who was a very pluralistic minister and a very pluralistic leader, who did engage with various leaders in their perspective, who did believe and who did not. Though unfortunately, those who he worked with were almost entirely written out of history, including Bayard Rustin, who was an LGBTQ man. He was a Black gay man back in the 60s, who was Dr. King's closest advisor. And because he was gay at that time, excuse me, he was almost completely forgotten until recently, because his legacy needed to be known and his work needed to be made aware of. And as we continue to celebrate Dr. King, the legacy, as well as, excuse me if I'm a bit hoarse, I've been talking all weekend. However, okay, that's better. However, as we're also acknowledging Religious Freedom Day, and also bringing to the forefront more of us who, in the words of legendary actress Butterfly McQueen, who many of us say, as my ancestors are free from slavery, I am free from the slavery known as religion. Because we have to have this discussion about religion, Christianity in particular, and its role in the enslavement of our ancestors, of our African ancestors, its roots in white supremacy, and institutionalized racism and injustice. These are the conversations and the education that we must continue to have, or that we must start seriously having, in order for us to move forward as a community, whether many people choose to believe or they don't. So my organization and who we represent also speaks to the challenges that many atheists face. Because if you didn't know, I'm going to tell you now that to be considered an atheist in the Black community is to be considered betraying our community. It is considered a betrayal to our race. It is considered a betrayal to our legacy and our history in this country, which could be further from the case. Because if we look to some of our iconic Black figures and our iconic heroes within our communities, we can look no further to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who is the foundation of Black History Month through starting Negro History Week, who was considered a freethinker and who challenged the institution of the Black church in the community. We can also look to famous literary artists like Lorraine Hansberry, who in A Raisin in the Sun described the character Benitha Younger, as her own, who was a Black atheist woman. We can also look to other famous Black freethinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. So the history of African-American atheism, free thought, humanism, and secularism has always been there, even though it has been largely obscured and almost ignored. So we have an obligation to acknowledge and reshape this narrative that has been unfortunately diminished in our communities. And so as more, and especially as more young people are letting go of those traditional beliefs and letting go of that fear that has been imparted not only in our ancestors, but also through generations of Black folks, whether they had to follow just to go along with the tradition of our communities. And we certainly acknowledge the important role that the church played within our communities, especially during times of Jim Crow. and legal segregation. However, again, the roles of those who did not believe, and also the legacy of people like Frederick Douglass, who challenged pro-slavery Christianity. This is a part of the legacy that, again, we must continue to discuss. We must continue to educate ourselves and to be aware of when it comes to moving forward and as we're looking to improve our communities. So the work of Black nonbelievers has definitely been supporting those Black atheists and religion doubters who felt that they were alone, who felt like they were on the brink of death because they could not deal with religious family members who were still trying to push their beliefs on them, who felt like they were about to die because they could not express said non-belief. The need for our support systems is growing. The diversity has always been there within our communities. And it is about time that we recognize it. And also, and we weren't going to fight for this seat at the table. Although I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad we are here. It is important for us, and it's important for everyone here to know and understand that we are here and that our voices are valuable and they're valid. And we're not just telling you to hear us or to believe us. We are telling you, we are telling you that we are here. And also we are telling you where to go find more information. We also want you to value evidence. We also want you to value information and be able to make a more concrete decision and also change your mind when there is new information available. And that is the point of education. That is the point of what we're doing here, especially with this project, especially as we want more children and more of us to know that we have a more pluralistic society. Speaking of the insurrection last week, and certainly we could compare it to another insurrection, one that is famous in Wilmington, North Carolina, in which people actually lost their, innocent Black folks lost their lives. We are seeing Christian nationalism on full display. It has not gone anywhere, but the more we are able to work together and continue this dialogue and continue to speak out against it, we can make strides and we can make a difference, because it is absolutely important. It is important for folks to acknowledge that there is this side of Christianity that has been damaging to our communities. There has been a side of religion that has kept us in a state of confinement, in a state of mental decapacitation for a number of reasons. And it doesn't mean that we're beating up on the history. We aren't beating up on the tradition, but we must be honest. And we have to be forthright about that. Because again, our perspectives on this are valid and they're important. So we absolutely must address and confront. And to actually do so can be painful. It was painful for many of us when we came to our conclusion that gods did not exist in actual form, because many were deeply involved in their religious communities, but they either educated themselves out of it or they came to this conclusion just to be told that it might be a phase, or that is something that white people do, or it is something that is it is not innate to Black folks, that therefore you aren't Black anymore. And this needs to change. I'm glad it is changing, but but we are sitting in a space now. We are at a crucial time. We are at a critical juncture, especially as we enter this new year. And as we continue to move forward with, again, the education process, also our community building, and how we conduct interfaith dialogue and engagement. This is a part of it. So acknowledging, addressing, but also how we move to problem solving. I try to be a solutions-based person, and also solutions based on the good evidence. At our 10th anniversary celebration, which we're currently on our lunch break on, we had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Sabrina Dent, who was formerly with the Religious Freedom Center, and on the importance of religious freedom and how it shouldn't cause harm to anyone. So the work that we're doing actually does speak to our communities and the issues that we face, and church-state separation is actually among them. So we were actually very, very happy to hear from her and to know that we have allies among us and that we are also allies with you, especially coming from the communities. I'm unapologetically Black. I was raised in this community, so I am a part of it just as much as anyone else is. And so are other atheists and religion doubters. We do not always need to agree, but we do need to better understand and work together. And we are here to answer any questions you have. We are not devil worshipers. If I do not believe in a God, that means I do not believe in a devil. Which means that, again, and many of us are very humanistic in nature. I also identify as a secular humanist, which means that my philosophy on life and outlook does not depend on a divine reward. It revolves around doing good for the world and doing good for our communities because it's the right thing to do, and also because we want to see our children and our families do better. So as I close, I'd like to once again thank you for this opportunity and invite anyone to ask any questions that they may have about my position, also our thoughts on the historical factors and also what's going on currently, and also work on ways that we can continue and also find ways that we can continue to work together and put and reshape and push this narrative that does include those of us who do not believe at all and who can offer many who can offer ideas and also solutions on how we can continue to improve our communities, especially from an evidence and education-based point of view. Thank you very much.
My goodness, Mandisa, thank you so much for your insight. Thank you so much for really, I want to celebrate you and Black non-believers for the 10 years of the work that you've been doing. And really thank you for showing up as your genuine, true self. And I want to shout out our colleague as well, Sabrina Dent. She was very influential as it relates to this work that we're doing, but she has her own work that she's doing around religious freedom and the African-American perspective. So please, please, please check out our website to see the awesome work that our other colleagues are doing around these topics. Next panelist that we have, I want to bring him up. He is the Reverend Quincy James Reinhardt. Reverend Quincy James Reinhardt is a PhD student in African American religious history and Black male studies at Chicago Theological Seminary. His doctoral research examines Bayard Rustin. You just spoke about that. Bayard Rustin in gay Black men's body and the 1960s civil rights movement. Reverend Quincy also is an associate campus minister, at the Morehouse College's Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel, led under the leadership of Dean Lawrence Crawford. Thank you so much, Quincy, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Trey, and thank you, David, for this extended invitation, and to the other esteemed guests. Thank you so much. It's good to be here. The date was January 1 and the year 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. This was a critical year for those shackled by chains, beaten, enslaved, treated like animals, and considered chattel. This was the year that President Abraham Lincoln issued a presidential proclamation, an executive order, a document purported to change a federal law that enslaved over 3 million Black people. The signing of this proclamation was intended to legitimize the freedom of those persons who were in bondage, who resided in the rebellion states. Furthermore, this document was to recognize that those who were slaves were now free. Although President Lincoln signed the document declaring Black people's freedom, Black people had to wait for another 2 years before they were considered truly free. The Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Lincoln, I argue, was nothing more than an illusion of freedom. With the few thoughts or the few moments that are mine, I want to offer this title as a blush of thought, The Ambiguity of Freedom. As we reflect over the past 4 years of Trump's disgraced presidency, the long, dreadful months of COVID-19, which has killed over 400,000 folks and counting, and the experience of being Black in America has meant living with a whole array of sounds, from the cry of Black blood rising from the streets to the Capitol insurrection incited by a sitting president, carried out by white supremacists, to the noisy political unrest that have settled all over the United States, as people of goodwill everywhere are angst at the brutality of Black and brown people dying senselessly at the hands of police officers, quasi-police officers, and vigilantes. Many of these Black people did not commit crimes, but the mere fact that they were Black and considered to be a threat gave law enforcement and quasi-law enforcement the implicit right to harass them, abuse them, and take their lives. Black people must be willing to write a new American history, challenging the Anglo-Saxon myth of their superiority, in which Black bodies were then and are still seen as a threat to their persons and to the institutional structures which have been set in place to subjugate and ultimately destroy the Black body politic, our civic engagement, our individual and corporate morale, our mental and physical health, our life perspectives. And even as I speak, we are still striving for this unrealized freedom. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood what it meant to fight against the ambiguity of freedom. On August 28, 1963, Dr. King gave one of the most profound speeches that challenged the systems that perpetuate the ambiguity of freedom while standing on the steps of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Dr. King began the I Have a Dream speech by saying, quote, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination, close quote. These words were uttered almost 58 years ago, and still today, many Black people are not free. So you may ask, what is the ambiguity of freedom? Or what does this have to do with religious freedom? In order for us to answer these queries, I must problematize our conception of freedom. The ambiguity of freedom lies in the fact that it is earnestly hoped for, but not yet realized. It is in the words of what civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson describes as hope unborn. America says that we are legally free citizens and that this country is the land of the free. But at the same time, the ambiguity of freedom is when 2 million Black and Latino people are incarcerated disproportionately at a higher rate than their white counterparts who commit the same offense. The ambiguity of freedom is the striking down of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. The ambiguity of freedom is when more prisons are built than schools are for learning. The ambiguity of freedom is the Housing Discrimination Act against minorities. The ambiguity of freedom is the HB2 bill, which placed restrictions on LGBTQ persons and forced trans people to use restrooms that do not represent their new gender identity. The ambiguity of freedom is when white nationalists can ransack our nation's capital, get in a brawl with law enforcement, and no one is shot dead, yet Had Black people committed such egregious acts, the National Guards would have shot us dead without blinking. We come from ancestors who understood what it meant to endure the ambiguity of freedom in the midst of what seemed to be a never-ending cycle of walking through the valley and the shadow of Black death and affliction. It was their religious resilience that kept them moving forward despite the times when hope unborn had actually died. They survived through white backlash, poll taxes, Reconstruction, voting discrimination, theft of land, lynch mob, Black codes, and other forms of racial and religious terrorism. In his book, Liberating Our Dignity, Saving Our Souls, Africana pastoral theologian Lee H. Butler Jr. posits, quote, survival for Africans in America from the colonial period through Western expansion was not guided by denying life, but by understanding the sanctity of life and the connectedness of all things. African survival, which became African American survival, has been guided by African spirituality. African Americans have been victims of everyday life-denying activity actualized on these shores. It was our faith in life, our spirituality that made our survival creative rather than destructive, close quote. The hope is the fact that Black people are survivors, because history is full of people who have survived and are surviving. Our survival is not for ourselves, but rather our survival is a testament and a witness to our oppressors that freedom is possible. In his book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery, Black psychologist Naim Akbar challenges Black people to look at what can happen when we free our individual and collective consciousness from psychological bondage and white supremacist ideologies. Freedom for Akbar is not some abstract concept, but he posits that Black singers, quote, Black singers must sing about it. Black researchers must identify it. Black actors must act it. Black scholars must conceptualize it. Black teachers must teach it. And Black preachers must preach it, close quote. Freedom must become the embodiment for the new possibility of what could be. For Harriet Tubman, freedom is escorting hundreds of slaves from the slaveholding South to points north. For Nat Turner, freedom is rebellion against the tyranny of slavery, regardless of the personal cost. For Martin Luther King Jr., freedom is the beloved world community and the strength to love all of God's creation. For Bayard Rustin, freedom is nonviolent resistance and the power to become angelic troublemakers. For Fannie Lou Hamer, freedom is being free from the burden of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. For Ella Josephine Baker, freedom is here and now in our righteous, organized self-help, as well as an eschatological promise. For James Baldwin, freedom is that which is to be taken by those who know it is their godly heritage. For Shirley Chisholm, freedom is an endless horizon to move resolutely towards. For James Cone, freedom is the source and norm of theology that must be actualized in the Black experience. For Howard Washington Thurman, freedom is a spiritual discipline. And for Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle to live with consciousness. As I close this talk, how will you actualize freedom, religious or otherwise, in your life? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Quincy, for your words. I want to take this time as well just to remind our attendees that all of these panelists will be on, so I ask that you stick around with us for a Q&A portion towards the end of our program. Please also use and utilize the chat and also utilize the Q&A because we will be presenting some of the audience's questions to our panelists as well. I also want to take this time to highlight the generous support from our donors, from the Andrew and Julie Klingstein Family Fund. I see that Miss Julie is online, so thank you so much for your wonderful, kind donations to the Cecil B. Day Foundation, to the CF Foundation, the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, the Cousins Foundation, the David, Helen, and Maureen Woodward Foundation, Freedom Forum as well, and also the Templeton Religion Trust, along with the enormous amount of anonymous generational donations that we've been receiving as well. We want to thank you all for generously donating towards this endeavor. Next, we have the Dr. Goldie Mohammed, who is an associate professor of language and literacy at Georgia State University's College of Education and Human Development. Additionally, she serves as director of the Urban Literacy Collaborative and Clinic and hosts a summer literacy institute called Black Girls Write. She is the 2014 recipient of the Promising New Researcher Award from the National Council of Teachers of English, and in 2017, Georgia State University Urban Education Research Awardee. In 2020, January of 2020, she also wrote a book entitled Cultivating Genius, an equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy. I present to you Ms. Goldie Mohammed.
Hello, everyone. Greetings. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the invitation to be amongst such genius and brilliance here. I'm learning a lot. I'm taking notes. And I'll be very brief because I know we want to get to the Q&A panel time. So I do work really with studying the historical genius and joy and excellence within Black communities, African communities, and African-American perspectives. And when I do work around education in schools, I'm really focusing on this idea of liberation for our youth, so that our young people can truly be themselves, be liberated in schools and curriculum, and have their teachers validate, celebrate who they are, including their identities, including their youth identities, which includes their religious identities or their non-religious identities. My work is really studying the ideas of freedom and liberation in curriculum and instruction. And when I do work on schools and schooling, I kind of use the analogy of a house, right? The house of our educational system for K-12 education is really built on ideals of whiteness, white supremacy, white culture, white representation, lacking to include the racial identities of people of color. It also was built on Christian and oftentimes so-called Christian beliefs. And I say so-called because when we go back to the 1600s as an example, Christianity was promoted in very oppressive ways. And we know that that is not Christianity how it was written. But when we think about this house, we want freedom and liberation inside, but the house was never built for that. When we study even the first textbook for teaching children how to read in schools in the 1600s, the New England Primer, which was heavily steeped in anti-sin and whiteness and white culture, it was no way for children of color, children of diverse religious identities, to see themselves in this textbook. But when I look at textbooks today and learning standards and curriculum in schools today, I'm still seeing a lack of liberation. I'm still seeing a lack of diversity of religious identities and racial identities and gendered identities, sexual identities. It still feels much like the New England Primer of the 1600s. Even if we take the state of Georgia, where I study standards for a living, The Common Core standards and the Georgia standards of excellence don't feel excellent at all. Neither one of these standards are common. The Common Core standards is not common to Black people. And if it's not common to Black people, how dare we have a set of learning standards for our school that do not meet the cultural needs of all students? In kindergarten, as an example, the Georgia standards are written to only celebrate Christian holidays, only to celebrate, except for Martin Luther King Jr., white people. Oftentimes, those white people are oppressors, like George Washington, and we're not telling the truth about their oppression and their racism. And so those standards then reflect the lesson plans and the curriculum, which then reflects the teacher evaluations and how teachers are measured. And again, they're absent of people, diversity of religion, of culture, of ethnicities. And so how can we really talk about freedom when our schools are so lacking it? As a Muslim girl, I remember leaving Gary, Indiana, which I had Black liberation and Black schools, and moving to the suburbs where I didn't see myself. I didn't see people of color. I didn't have a teacher of color throughout my whole experience in the suburb. And the curriculum was never written where I can see myself, where I can live and breathe freely in school. And then we celebrate so many holidays that were grounded in Christianity that Eid and Ramadan was never a thing. I never got to say, yes, I'm fasting. It was othered. It was like pushed to the side. They would not even say my full name, Gul Nisar, when I moved into these schools, let alone when Halloween was celebrated. I thought I had to go get a costume to just fit in, because what we are asking implicitly and explicitly to children in schools is for them to check their identities at the door. Their racial identities, their gender identities, their religious identities, all these different things where they don't feel free. And the curriculum never teaches us to love and celebrate who we are. I never had curriculum where I can love and celebrate my Blackness, me being a Black girl, me being a Black Muslim girl. I didn't see decorations in the stores during Ramadan and Eid. I didn't have a greeting card that I can just go and buy. I didn't have decorations. I couldn't celebrate it as a holiday on the school calendar. And even when I was a middle school teacher, I was penalized for celebrating Eid, because you got these bonus checks and celebrations when you did not miss one day. And I did not miss one day except for my holiday. And for that, I disqualified for it. But we never went to school on Christmas and oftentimes Jewish holidays. And so we know when we see these types of things in society that were described by my co-panelists, when we see oppression and racism and religious discrimination and us stereotyping and oppressing Muslims and other people, when we see that stuff in society, we see it in our schools. I had a teacher tell me that she got in trouble for teaching Breonna Taylor's name. And I said, did you also get in trouble for teaching Anne Frank's name? And she said, no. And I said, well, why on earth would one young girl's oppression be more important and validated and worth teaching than another? And for Black people and for Black women like me, I've had intersections of these problems, of being Black, of being a woman, of being a Muslim. And so religious freedom for me is one of the worst and oppressive things you can take away from someone, because before I am anything else, I am a Muslim. Before I am Black, before I'm woman, before I'm a Midwesterner, right? Before I'm a professor and all these other identities I carry. You know, I'm reminded, whether we're talking about society or schools, that people must have the right to worship or not worship as they would like, as long as it does not oppress someone else. As long as, and that's what it means to be human. is to think, act, believe, worship the way you do, as long as it does not oppress, hurt, harm someone else. That is what it means to be human. And it's sad because we don't have humanizing practices and beliefs and policies in society. Therefore, we do not have it in schools. Our Georgia performance standards, our learning standards are not humanizing. They are designed to celebrate whiteness and white culture. And so, when I think about religious freedom, I think about not being othered, not telling students that you have to give up a piece of who you are in order to fit in this school or in this classroom or in this curriculum. It's not deficiencies to be overcome. Religious freedom means that you allow spaces where students can know their faith even more and celebrate and validate, and teaching practices should respond to it. It's feeling that the ways in which you dress, speak, worship isn't marginalized but validated. And religious freedoms means do not get consumed in your own way of life and beliefs and values and think that everybody else has to fit it in order to be supported by you. So yes, religious freedom matters, just like Black lives matter, just like atheist lives matter, and immigrant lives and gendered lives, and so on. And young people especially need to know this so that they will believe in society and with our schools that they do not have to be someone else to be successful, to thrive, and to be loved. And that's really, at the end of the day, for me, what it's about. Helping teachers to develop the sort of internal, it's hard because you cannot regulate people's hearts in training sessions. But as much as I have opportunities to work with thousands of teachers per week, I'm always trying to have them think and reflect upon these self-beliefs, their bias, the things that they need disrupting that's in their minds, so that they can better educate students of diverse racial backgrounds and other backgrounds and religious backgrounds, so that those students feel like they are loved and they belong. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for highlighting, I guess, the criticalness, if that's a word, the criticalness of religious freedom, not only for this generation, but for the next generation, right? And how our teachers or professors are even teaching or speaking or perpetuating some of the things in which we're trying to get over or become free of. So thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed, for those words. Our last panelist for the evening before we get into our Q&A question mode is Billy Michael Honor. Billy Michael Honor is a public scholar and civic organizer whose progressive and compelling insights have made him a sought-after speaker and social commentator. He currently serves as the Racial Justice and Religion Fellow for the Aspen Institute. In his role, he researches and writes about the role of religious pluralism in combating racial justice. In addition, Billy also travels extensively, providing public scholarship on issues at the intersection of faith, racial justice, community organizing, and politics. I bring you Billy Michael Honor.
Thank you. It's so good to be with everyone. I've really enjoyed everything I've heard. My fellow panelists have been putting the truth on the loose today in very important ways. And so I'm really glad to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity to address this very important topic. As I think about the question that's been put forth that we've been wrestling with about religious freedom in this moment that we find ourselves, in this moment that we find ourselves, I can't help but think about it as someone who sits at the intersection of religion, community organizing and politics as an organizer. For the past several years, I've been doing the work that many others do as well, which is bringing communities and people and leaders together to create a plan for how it is we create change in our communities. And that work is very important to me, because I know that truly much of what we see in terms of progress in our communities, in our country, could not have happened without the dedicated work of organizers, many of whom don't get the credit. They don't get their names called in the history books, but they are nonetheless the people who have been committed to going out and doing the work of creating change every day, because we all know that change is not inevitable, that it has to be forced, it has to be pushed, it has to be strategically planned for. We were talking, name Dr. King for many things. We'll call him a minister, we will call him a civil rights activist. What he won't be called, that he should be called more of, is he was a public theologian and he was an organizer. He was using the tools of faith. He was using the resources of his faith tradition and others to create change in the community, bringing people together. And we have to talk more about those skills. But as I think about that, and I think about the question about religious freedom and why does it matter, in the work that I do, when we think about organizing, particularly someone who works from a faith-rooted perspective as I do as an organizer, this question of religious freedom is always there for me. It never leaves, right? And one of the reasons that it does always sit there is because the challenge that we run into, right? Even in spaces where people are working for justice, organizing people and bringing them together, there is still the propensity to, even in these spaces that I've seen, to create environments that are Christocentric and averse to other religious perspectives, and exalt leadership that fall within a historic narrative of being Black, charismatic, Black men most times. And I could even get more specific and say Baptist men, right? And so a lot of the archetype images that you get are Black Baptist clergymen, right? And certainly that is a part of the tradition. We know that, right? But as you've heard throughout this entire talk that we've been having, that's not the only narrative. That's not the only tradition, right? And so still in this year that we sit, with all that we know and with all the knowledge that we have, all of the history that's been brought forth in this conversation, we still have to push for, when we do this work of organizing, creating change and social justice together, to create religious freedom in spaces of justice, right? That some of our most adverse spaces to the type of religious freedom values that we're talking about are among people who are trying to do the work of so-called liberating people, right? So much so that we have to press the claim, right? That in a real sense, what we need to understand is that Christians, or Christianity in and of itself, has already been laid out, has been as much responsible for the liberation of our people as the enslavement of our people, right? Has already been named, right? Which means that we also have to begin to tell the truth about what really is taking place in our communities in terms of people's diverse spiritual lives, right? And part of the reason why I think this has continued is because we have not been honest about the fact that in much of our communities, what we've seen is a very robust and diverse spirituality among people, right? And bringing that to bear in our conversations about how it is we want to structure the way in which it is we do our work of liberation and the way in which we do our work of collective organizing to create change, right? Part of what I've tried to be committed to do as an organizer is to make sure we create space for non-Christian voices in our faith-based spaces, right? It's been so important to do that, to understand that as much as we want to make sure that there are those who represent churches there, that there are also those who represent mosques, synagogues, and temples, and places of no faith, right? That they are able to come together and to do the work together and to find common civil religious language, right? That we can all begin to rally around so that we can create change, right? Now, I do recognize that this work that I'm talking about is a contested space. And I want to name that because I don't think we've named it just yet, right? That is very important. It is very, very important for us to begin to name that religious freedom is a contested space in our time. I know this because I have been down to the Capitol, the Georgia State Capitol, and had to participate in protest and talk about how it is we don't support certain Religious Freedoms Act. If in fact those acts themselves are actually the veil for discrimination against certain protected classes of people, right? And so we can't sit here and act as though religious freedom is an uncontested space. It's a contested space in our time. There are lots of people using the phrase, there are lots of people using the words, but we don't all mean the same thing when we use them, right? In so many states across this country, there are people using the language of religious freedom, but what they really mean is that they want to be allowed to use their interpretation of their faith as the predicate and as permission to be able to deny services to people for whom they do not like or want to discriminate against or find issue with, right? That's the bottom line. And so what we have to then do is push to say, since it's contested ground, you can't really do the work of religious freedom in a serious way without also engaging in the other work of addressing religious miseducation. We have a great degree of religious miseducation that is present in our land, right? Keep in mind, right now, the greatest domestic terrorist threat to our country is a religious organization, right, called white nationalism, right, which is a throwback to what we might call, remember the Ku Klux Klan called themselves a Christian organization, right? They weren't burning donuts, they were burning crosses. You understand, right? They were sending a religious message. They believed themselves to be putting back in order the actual God-given structure of society that placed white bodies and white lives at the top. They saw themselves doing this as knights of this sort of call of God that they believe, right? And so it wasn't really possible to truly address the issues that had to do with white nationalism in this country or any form, right? Any perverse form of religious expression without dealing with religious miseducation, right? And I think we have to really make sure that we wrap our minds around the fact that even enslaved Africans understood that there was a difference between good religion and bad religion. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Certainly, Lord, right? And I think that it's already been outlined what we mean by that. And what we mean by that is that any religious expression that chooses to dehumanize any individual, that chooses to relegate to the margins of the fringes any personality, right? We have to begin to call into question that, right? And so I want to name that because we can't really do this work in an engaged way and in a way with integrity unless we name that and talk about that really is the real challenge of our time, is defining what really is religious freedom and what is our association to it. Finally, let me say this. Some of the tenets of religious freedom in our time have to do with a lot of high and lofty concepts, right? Like the one we're having now. And it's very important. We should continue to have these. But what history tells us, and I say this as an organizer, is that change doesn't happen in sort of top-down authoritative ways, right? That just simply the notion of religious liberty or religious freedom and putting it out there in these values don't create the type of change that we need to see, right? That actually change happens through everyday people taking seriously in their own lives the values that we're talking about, seriously questioning and seriously paying attention to what's going on in their own religious formation, right? And so as we begin to transition to the latter part of this conversation, it's probably the most important part of this conversation, which is how shall we live as citizens, everyday citizens in this country, with a consciousness that is shaped and formed in the values that we're talking about in ways that we begin to model, each and every one of us, in the ways in which we've been placed, right? of an openness and acceptance to how it is people are living out religious values and or rejecting religious values, and still seeing that as a principle of how it is we live in beloved community together, right? Pushing the question for grandma, for cousin, for uncle, for brother, for sister. That is what we have to do to actualize this, because at the end of the day, as Curtis Mayfield said, it's the train of everyday people that's going to bring it in for us. And so I thank you for this time to be here with you today.
I want to thank all of our panelists. I am just elated, ecstatic due to the work that you all are doing, each and every one of you with your own individual roles. But now I want us to pivot very quickly. I'm looking at the time, pivot very quickly to our Q&A question portion. I have some questions for you all, and I'm sure our audience has some questions as well. This has been a blessing to me. I just want to say and put that out there. And as you can see, the chat is going off. People are thanking you as well. But let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to stay right here with you, Mr. Honor. And I want to ask you the question. So recently here in Georgia, we've witnessed a historical moment, right? We witnessed the moment of Reverend Raphael Warnock in the Georgia electing its first Black senator. My question for you is, what role do you think religious freedom played in his election?
That's a loaded question. If you know the history of how we got here, right? I'll try to be real brief with this. I mean, religion favored pretty predominantly in this campaign. His challenger chose to use as one of her chief resources of defense, if you will, is his Black liberation theology heritage, having been a student of Dr. James Cone. And to be a supporter of one of the primary pastors of that tradition, the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright. And she made a gamble. She made a gamble. And the gamble was, if I can put this out here into the public, it will scare enough of the electorate, primarily the white electorate, enough that he won't win. Part of what some of us have been celebrating is that tactic was not successful. Partly because that card had been played some over a decade ago in 2008, and we've come a very long way, as you all know, since then, in terms of some of our religious education, some of our cultural education around whites being able to hear that you can hear a Black preacher saying on TV on a continuous loop that white America needs to repent from the sin of whiteness, and that doesn't jar folks in the way that it might have in times back, right? So some of that has to do with the work of a lot of people who are on this call and other people who have been just pushing for better public scholarship, public education, and religious education. And the final thing I'll say is that as Reverend Warnock, who's a good friend of mine, we worked on, oh my God, there's so many things we worked on over years, primarily the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration, which a conference that I and Rabbi Lydia and Rabbi Berg planned 2 years ago here in Georgia. Part of that work, right, has to do with his deep abiding commitment to multi-faith religious organizing, right? And so I think part of what you saw is that same coalition that he's been working with for over a decade here in this state came together to support, right? Because it was a coalition that before there was this election, we've been working to try to reduce the amount of people who are incarcerated in this country, expand voting rights, etc., from a multi-faith perspective for a long time. And so this was part of just an extension of that work.
Thank you so much for that answer. Shifting just a little bit, Mr. Andrew Klingstein actually put a question in the chat. I am actually going to direct it to Mandisa, but panelists, please feel honored to give your input as well. And he asked the question, why do you think atheism is stigmatized in the African-American community, perhaps more so than in other communities?
Well, I will start by saying that it goes to the heavy tradition of religion and faith within our communities. It's certainly, like I said before, we do acknowledge the role that the church and religious leaders played in times of extreme institutional injustice, though I would have to inject in there that there were many religious leaders, there were many churches who were reluctant to get involved in the civil rights movement out of understandable fear. And this is something that I think the church has absolutely been dishonest about. But we do have to take into consideration the history and the legacy of how religion, and Christianity in particular, has been imposed. And because the stigma of atheism is that, of course, for those who don't, if you don't believe, of course, what is the most common thing that you hear? That you're going to hell, that you're damned. I mean, it is a very, it is a very stigmatizing thing for people, and even in communities. We see this in certain sects of Christianity, that if you even dare to challenge those beliefs, if you dare to challenge that indoctrination, you are shunned. And somehow that you are just labeled as just almost like the worst person ever. So atheism, to me, and not just to me, but to more Black folks, it isn't just about how it appears to be a scary word at first, but also, again, I remember this woman, Black woman, told me that she could not believe that I had the nerve to identify as an atheist, as a Black woman, in front of white devils. So again, it is also seen as being this thing that white people do, even though we've seen white Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and its roots in religion. So, but for us, because there is such a huge emotional tie into religion and the church, and because it has been such a huge steeple and such a huge influence in our communities, which again, we acknowledge, it unfortunately does not leave much room to have that dialogue about those of us who don't believe and the reasons why. Sometimes we're just automatically dismissed. You hear that you're a non-believer, an atheist would just shut down. And that's a huge part of it. And I'd love to hear what some of the other panelists think about that.
Anybody else? No. All right. Staying just very briefly with that, I wanted to hear from you more specifically, is religious freedom dangerous for a secular society? And what I mean by that is, and we also have Suzanne Thomas, she also asks the question, in creating civil non-religious language, how can we remove under God from the Pledge of Allegiance, or in God we trust from our currency, or so help me God in being sworn in at the court? And that's the kind of thinking that I'm thinking about as well, knowing that religious freedom, but yet in the court, we're still being sworn in, with a Bible. So are you seeing religious freedom being more dangerous? I don't want to lead you to an answer, but do you see religious freedom being dangerous in a secular society? And how do we shift that narrative?
It can be, and we have seen this, especially as we look to the cake bakers case in Colorado, in which the cake maker discriminated against the LGBTQ couple. And we've also seen religious freedom be used as a weapon, as as the other gentleman said about the Ku Klux Klan, and how they ran on a Christian platform, that they were good Christians. And so, but it is going to be up to other Christians. It is going to be up to other folks who are religious and who are progressive enough to know that they trust the science and evidence as well. It's going to take more of us to work together on what religious freedom really is. And regarding the question about under God, that is actually a very recent addition to the American dollar. We can look to the Treaty of Tripoli, And also back to the quote unquote founding fathers and how, and we also need to dispel this notion that America was founded as a Christian nation, which it wasn't. And also look to the Treaty of Tripoli, in which there was an effort to induct more of religion into state and government, and that was prevented. So adding under God on the American dollar was fairly recent in the 1950s, and it's about time that I think it does go away, because it does a disservice to other faith traditions. It does. So it's interesting, the language of God and how it has been infused in government, even though it wasn't founded on a religious principle. It was supposed to be freedom of religion. So there was to always be state church separation. And it's about time that, again, we be more honest about the history and the education and getting involved to change that.
Absolutely. I think Brother Honor calls it the miseducation of religious freedom. Reverend Quincy, I want to ask you, historically, how has HBCUs, I'm a product of a HBCU, you're also a product of a HBCU, how has HBCUs been an avenue for religious freedom, and how is that tradition being continued today?
Yeah, so we understand historically that HBCUs are the backbone, or religion, right, is the backbone to many of our HBCUs. So I attended Wilberforce University, which was founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1856, an institution that was founded and operated and owned by Blacks, right? While we see a shift taking place in terms of a lot of religion departments going underground or being eradicated, what we do see is this type of tradition that continues. So you have people like Floyd Flake, right, who went to Congress, served in Congress while serving as a pastor. But I think one of the best examples of this is the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel that is housed at Morehouse College, that is now 41 years old, right? What we see as a tradition or products of an HBCU out of the religious tradition is a Raphael Warnock, right, who served as the president of the Chapel Assistance Program, right? You have a Delman Coates or an Otis Moss. A lot of the pastors that are, nationally known are from, Morehouse College, but birth out of this Kingian tradition that represents or believes in, right, representing all faith traditions, right? So the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel is one a space that honors religious diversity. So you have had persons like a Farrakhan there, or a Karen Armstrong, or a Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, right? And so the teaching that Dean Carter implements is religious pluralism, right? And allowing students and persons to represent, what they believe to be their belief. So yeah, HBCUs, again, is the backbone to a lot of the formation of or religion, right, is the backbone to a lot of the formation of Black colleges.
Thank you so much. I want to pivot and ask Dr. Mohammed, because you're more of, Morehouse is a privatized college, you're more at a state level, a local level, and you deal a lot with educators. I want to ask you, how has religious freedom informed your work as it relates to the equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy?
So my framework for equity in and around schools comes from studying Black literary societies in the 1800s, which were our nation's first book clubs led by abolitionists And as they were reading and writing and thinking together, they were creating actionable steps toward improving the state of humanity, as anti-racism, anti-Black racism. And I use that as a model for how teachers should educate, including professors like myself should educate at the higher ed or K-12. And so the 5 elements of the model is cultivating, number 1, identity. Classrooms and higher education should be spaces, period, for every child or adult to know, celebrate, love, and learn more about themselves. And it does not matter if it is their racial, gender, sexual, religious, age, youth identities, environmental identities. We have so many different layers of ourselves. But they should never feel like they cannot fully be themselves or show up themselves. So that's my work, is helping cultivate identity development. But to also learn about people who are different than them. You know, we learn about Christian holidays, but in Christianity, do we learn about atheists in schools? Do we learn about, it's not about pushing a religious identity. It's about educating on different people. People is educating about yourself and people who are different than you. When we educate our young people about people who are different than them, the hope is they will grow up to be less inclined to hurt, hate, or harm other people. The second goal is skill development. What skills and proficiencies are we teaching? Number 3 is intellectualism. What are my students becoming smart about intellectually? We stay so fixated on solving for X's and fluency and decoding all these skills that our students are not intellectually learning anything in schools. And the 4th is criticality. This is where we teach them about anti-oppression, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anything that is related to oppression, anti-racism. And the 5th goal is joy. How do we cultivate joy within our young people and our adults? So many times students their spirits are being murdered in schools, especially Black kids. We can't even get to religious freedoms because we are trying to just show up as being Black. And so they don't have joy in our schools because they don't feel like they can be themselves. Queer, LGBTQ students feel the same way. And we can even add people who have varying religious points of views and practices and cultures on top of that. And so how do we cultivate joy? And so religion falls into the identity category, the criticality, because we should live in a time where we don't just center one anything. And we know that that's happening, right? When it comes to religion, when it comes to race. And we should live in a time where we don't validate and celebrate and teach just one anything. But we know through our structures of our house, of our nation, through documents, through the dollar bill, through the learning standards, it is not inclusive. So we talk about equity all day long, but are we really inclusive? Are we really providing opportunities where everybody have access or just some? And so the model is a solution for teachers, but is a response to all these problems we are naming.
Thank you. For someone who wants to be an ally for your work and really want to help with that work, who creates these core standards? And also for a lot of our non-teachers and for some of our teachers in our audience, how can they help, for lack of a better term, influence or de-influence, the whiteness that is within the school systems?
So nobody knows. I ask teachers all the time, can you name the people who created our learning standards, our Common Core, Georgia? It's like a mystery. Are they people of color? Are they diverse people who live diverse lives? And nobody knows. And then, the problem stems from the US Department of Education. Why do we still have janky learning standards that are incomplete and not responsive to Black liberation, period? And the people who we struggle to get it right with the most in our nation are Black people. I don't care if it's schools, incarceration, jobs, opportunity, COVID. Why is it that we are struggling to get it right and to support and educate and heal Black people. And then you don't write learning standards that are a response. So most of these people are not people of color, are not LGBTQ, don't have religious diversity. These are people that fit one narrative and they wrote one narrative. So it's very clear who built the house. And so it's up to, if you're talking about education, you know, what would our US Secretary of Education do differently? And just because you're a person of color does not mean you are about the liberation of people of color. And so what are you going to do differently? I am tired of all these Band-Aids when we don't fix the structures of the house and we just do our little social justice work inside the house. We are perpetuating all this stuff that is hurting us.
You hear it here, people, to get out there, to bug your senators and all of your other public officials to really get on the ground and start making some impact and some change. I have one more question, and then I'm going to close us out. This is for everyone, but more specifically, I want to hear from you, Brother Honor, because you do a lot with community organizing, you do a lot with social justice work. Can religious freedom help build community?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. It absolutely can help because when done correctly, what it does is it creates an expansive place that allows for the true community to come together and be represented. One of the things that we also should name in this is that what a lot of times hinders that, I was thinking about this as I listened to, Reverend soon to be Dr. Quincy Reinhardt talk about HBCUs, and that is the respectability politics. When we tie respectability politics to particular religious traditions, and so to be respectable, oftentimes the African American community, you show up as Christian, and you look at one of our former presidents, Barack Obama, who pretty much said that he chose to become a part of a church for creating a certain stature and standard in that South Side Chicago community, right? When you read his actual religious views, he sounds more like a religious humanist than anything. But he became United Church of Christ. And so that's out of this sort of this politics of respectability. And until we begin to, remove ourselves from tying certain religious traditions to what it means to be respectable or have standing and begin to get a more expansive view, we'll still have challenges with religious freedom helping to create change and build community. But I do think there are pockets and times where we see it and it works wonderful and it works well. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
Awesome. Thank you. Amandisa, I want to present that same question to you as well. Can religious freedom help build community?
Absolutely, I do. I think that, the ability to choose for a person's individual reasons and also looking at the better needs of community will actually help to improve us. Whether, and education is going to be the key. Education, better information, better communication. All of that is going to be important and crucial to how we better build and how we better inform on religious freedom and how people better understand it. And again, it's for those of us who don't believe at all and those who still choose to believe in some form or fashion. Again, it doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything, but when the common focus is the people, and especially Black folks, and especially how we still have to navigate in this country that has been historically undermined us, and the institutions have never sought to ever see us free, period. When we look at that and look at the history and again continue to educate and re-educate ourselves, because that's always a process. When we continue to do that, I think we can absolutely move forward.
Dr. Mohammed. Can religious freedom build community?
Yeah, why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't anything beautiful and diverse help build community? Again, as long as your beliefs and your practices do not oppress me. You can be my friend as long as you love Black people and Muslims and Black women. It's the same answer. Having diversity in religious views and thoughts and practices, it is only a beautiful thing, just like having diversity in race and gender and other things that we have in thought. It could only be a beautiful thing. And simply put, as long as it does not work to oppress other people. And you can oppress other people through looks, through thoughts, and through actions.
Thank you. Reverend Quincy.
Ashe. Yeah, and I would just add to that, most importantly, it teaches one how to be in community with the other.
Thank you so much, everybody. From the words of Martin Luther King, this is us expressing our beloved community. So there you have it. This has been an awesome program. Does religious freedom matter in 2021? African American perspectives. I want to thank our donors. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Franklin to being our keynote speaker. You will be able to follow all of the different things that the Georgia 3Rs Project is doing locally here in Georgia, but also nationally with the Freedom Forum by checking out our website and the different things that all of our colleagues have going on. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And we pray that you have a safe and healthy Martin Luther King weekend as you guys continue to celebrate. Thank you again. And until we meet again, religious freedom from the African American perspective does matter.